Someone called you a pushover again. It wasn't a compliment. It happened right after you backed down, again, without asking for what was yours. And the person next to you rolled their eyes like they were pointing out a flaw, like you needed to learn how to stand your ground, needed to stop being so easy, like this thing you do, never creating friction, was actually a problem to be fixed. There's a difference between giving in because you have no other option and giving in because you chose to. Nobody's ever bothered to ask which one you are. You've lost count of how many times you swallowed a response you had every right to give. Lost count of how many times you watched someone step exactly where you'd already warned, with a look, with silence, not to step. And you still said nothing, smiled, helped anyway, stayed later, lent money again, accepted an excuse that wasn't convincing anyone, including the person giving it and everyone around you. Read it as weakness. Read it as naivety. Read it as someone who still hasn't learned the game everyone else already plays. The game of collecting debts, refusing, guarding what's yours with everything you've got. Meanwhile, on the inside, you knew something you could never explain without it sounding like an excuse. You knew you weren't giving in out of fear. You were giving in because, in that moment, you decided it wasn't worth it. This has a name. Almost nobody stops to name it. Most people spend years assuming there's only one kind of nice person, the kind who can't help it, the kind therapists and self-help books love to warn you about. So when you recognize yourself in some of what you're hearing, you assume you're that kind too, and you start bracing for the part where you're told to toughen up. That's not where this goes. What's coming isn't a warning about being too soft. It's a distinction almost nobody draws between two things that have been sitting under the exact same label your entire life. There are two people who look identical from the outside. Both smile when someone cuts the line. Both say they're fine when they're not. Both help even when they're exhausted. Listen even with no energy left. Forgive even without an apology. From the outside, you can't tell them apart. Two versions of the same nice person, the same easy target, the same someone easy to convince, easy to use, easy to leave for last. But on the inside, they have nothing in common. The first one gives in because she doesn't know how to do anything else. She's never learned there's another option. She confuses her own worth with the absence of conflict and lives afraid that if she says no even once, something important will collapse. She doesn't choose to be nice. She doesn't know how to be anything else. And the price for that is steep, quiet, charged daily in small amounts she doesn't always notice. The second one gives in too, smiles too, helps too, listens too, but she knows, with a clarity the first one never had, that she could act differently. She reads the situation, decides it isn't worth the fight, and takes the lighter path because she understands something most people never do, that spending energy on every provocation hands that provocation power it never should have had. From the outside, they look like the same person. One of them is disappearing. The other is exercising the hardest kind of control there is. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations that the best revenge is not becoming like the person who hurt you, not as resignation, as strategy. He ran an empire surrounded by people who wanted his power, his attention, his reaction, and he understood that reacting to every provocation was exactly what those people were counting on. Real strength, to him, was never in striking back. It was in keeping your own nature intact even when someone was trying to corrupt it. That changes everything about what being kind actually means. Kindness that comes from fear needs defending all the time because deep down it knows it's fragile. It's the kind that explains itself, justifies itself, gets hurt when mistaken for weakness because, somewhere underneath, it worries that might be true. Kindness that comes from choice doesn't need defending at all. It knows exactly what it is, so it doesn't flinch when someone reads it wrong. The question was never whether you're a nice person. The question was always where that niceness comes from. If you've ever written something like that in another video's comments, you already know what I mean. If you haven't yet, this is a good time to start. Write one word below. Recognize. If any of this has been you, there's a scene that repeats. almost identical, in the life of someone who confuses the two. Someone asks for a favor they've asked for before, never once returned. And there are two ways to say yes to that. Ways that look identical on the outside and are nothing alike on the inside. In the first version, you say yes because you're afraid of what happens if you don't, afraid of looking selfish, afraid of losing the relationship, afraid of the uncomfortable silence a no would create. You say yes, and something small and resentful stays behind, doesn't go away, quietly builds up every time the scene repeats. You didn't say no because you couldn't, and that makes the moment lighter and everything after it heavier. In the second version, you look at the same request and decide, with total clarity, that saying yes matters more than arguing. You know you could say no. You'd have the argument, the grounds, even people watching who'd back you up, but you choose not to spend energy on it because you understand that not every provocation deserves a response, and protecting your own peace matters more than proving a point. You say yes, and nothing resentful stays behind because the decision was already processed and closed the moment you made it. The scene is identical. The gesture is identical. The words are the same. What happens underneath is the exact opposite. Epictetus taught that it's not events that disturb us, but the opinions we hold about them. And the difference between the two ways of giving in sits exactly there, in the opinion each one carries about its own gesture. One believes she had no choice. The other knows she chose. That changes everything that comes next. The same split shows up inside a relationship, in a way that's even harder to spot, because affection blurs everything. There's the version of you that accepts, again, something that should have been addressed a long time ago, because you're afraid bringing it up will shake something that already feels too fragile for one more conversation. That version swallows it, week after week, and the silence piles up like a debt nobody admits to collecting. She calls it patience. It's fear wearing love's clothes. And there's the version of you that accepts the same behavior after already weighing privately, whether it's grounds for walking away, and decides, fully aware, that now isn't the time, that the relationship is worth more than this one issue, and that raising it now would cost more than it would fix. This version is quiet too, but her silence isn't debt. It's a decision to quiet people at the same table. One is losing herself slowly. The other is simply choosing her battles with a clarity the first one never had. The same split shows up at work, in a shape almost nobody recognizes, as the same pattern. Someone on the team delivers less than they should, and the task lands, once again, on you. On one side is the version that takes it on because confrontation feels unbearable, who's rehearsed the conversation about pulling their weight more times than she can count and never once had it, who carries the extra work dragging resentment with nowhere to go. That resentment doesn't disappear, it settles, builds, and one day shows up disguised as exhaustion, irritation over nothing, a sudden urge to quit that seems to come out of nowhere but has actually been building for months. On the other side is the version that takes on the same task, after coldly weighing that this particular fight, at this particular moment, would cost more than just doing the work. She notices the unfairness too, sees clearly that she's being used, but chooses not to spend ammunition on a battle she's deliberately decided isn't worth the price. And when the task is done, no resentment lingers, because there's no open tab. The decision was made, carried out, closed. From the outside, both women did the exact same thing, took the task delivered on time, smiled at the next meeting. On the inside rounding, the other is quietly exercising one of the most understated forms of power there is. If you saw the video about people who drain your energy, you'll recognize this same mechanism from a different angle, because the one who gives in out of fear is exactly the one who ends up depleted after contact with people like that, without ever understanding why. And the one who gives in by conscious choice is the one who walks away from the same interaction basically untouched, because she never handed the other person the power to decide her own state of mind. The difference between the two was never in the gesture. It was always in what happens 1 second before it. There's a specific moment where this shows up more clearly than anywhere else, It's the moment someone crosses a line of yours, plainly, no disguise, and you feel the reaction rise before any conscious decision gets made. The one who gives in out of fear swallows the whole reaction in that moment, smiles over the discomfort, steps away from her own position so fast she doesn't even notice she's already stopped defending anything, and carries it afterward, for hours, replaying the scene, imagining what she should have said, feeling the weight in her body of an anger that never had anywhere to go. The one who gives in by choice feels the same reaction rise in that exact moment. The difference isn't in whether she feels it, it's in what she does. With that 1 second before acting, she names, internally, what's happening, breathes, before responding, and then decides, fully aware that it doesn't warrant the energy a response would cost. Choosing not to react here isn't a lack of strength. It's strength in its highest form. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events, and that realizing this is where you find real strength. This isn't about not feeling the provocation. It's about what you do with the space between feeling it and responding to it. Marcus Aurelius had a specific habit for this, mentioned more than once in his meditations. Before responding to any provocation, he'd ask himself whether it would still matter a year from now. Most provocations don't survive that question. They feel urgent in the exact moment they happen, then dissolve almost completely once set next to time. This isn't indifference, it's proportion, and the one who gives in by choice, even without a name for the practice, already does this most days without realizing she's repeating an exercise that's 2,000 years old. The one who gives in out of fear never asks that question to her. Every provocation feels the size of the whole world, because she hasn't yet learned to put distance between what she feels now and what it'll mean later. There's also a cost nobody names, one that belongs only to the first of the two women. It's the cost of never trusting her own kindness, because when you give in out of fear, part of you always suspects that if you had real strength, you'd have acted differently. That suspicion builds, quietly, until you start resenting your own kindness, as if it were proof you're weak, instead of evidence that you chose, over and over, not to become the person who provoked you. Seneca wrote that no one can be harmed by anyone but themselves. There's a hard read on that, applied right here. The greatest damage kindness suffers doesn't come from someone misreading it. It comes from when you start believing they read it right. Of the two possible prisons, this one is the quietest. It's not the person who takes advantage of your kindness who really hurts you. It's the voice afterward that whispers she might have a point. There's one last scene, and it usually plays out at home, with the people you love most, which makes it even harder to see. A child, a parent, a sibling, someone who knows exactly where to press because they've known you for years, makes an offhand comment about how you always give in, always back down, always put everyone else first. And there are, again, two ways to carry that comment. In the first, you carry it as an accusation. You spend days turning it over, questioning every generous thing you've ever done, quietly asking yourself whether you're too weak for this family, this job, this world that seems to reward only the loudest people in the room. The comment lands and sets up shop, becomes something you keep repeating to yourself, alone, long after the person who said it has forgotten they said it. In the second you hear the same comment, feel the same brief discomfort, and let it pass, because you already know, with a certainty that doesn't need anyone's approval, where your generosity comes from. You don't need to prove anything to that person, not because you don't care, because the source of your kindness was never on the table, and one comment doesn't have the power to undo a decision you already made about who you want to be. The simplest way to find out which one you are is to notice what's left afterward, after giving in, after swallowing it, after taking the lighter path. If what's left is resentment, a weight that's still there hours later, a wish you'd said something else, then the kindness you just practiced is still tied to fear. But if what's left is just a closed decision, no trace, no replay loop, none of that spiral of things you should have said, then you're already practicing the other kind, even if you didn't have a name for it until now. The body always knows which one you lived, even when the mind still doesn't have the word for it. Epictetus said that real wealth isn't having a lot, it's needing little. There's a version of that in how you deal with people trying to provoke you. The person who needs to react to every provocation is admitting, without realizing it, that her peace depends on someone else's behavior. The person who chooses not to react is declaring, without a word, that her peace isn't for sale, not even to whoever's offering the highest price. That doesn't mean not feeling it. It means no longer confusing feeling it with needing to respond to it. Of the two versions of you that have existed until now, only one still makes sense going forward. Right below which one you recognize more often in your own life. The one who gives in out of fear, or the one who already chooses. There's one final scene that sums it all up. It's the moment someone, after watching you give in one more time, says quietly that you should learn to stand your ground. And it used to sting, because it landed right on the doubt you already carried about yourself. Now, if you've already crossed that line, the comment just passes by without finding anywhere to stick. Not because you stopped caring, because you already know, with a certainty that needs no proof for anyone, where your kindness comes from. Nobody's ever going to see the difference from the outside. It only exists for the person living it from the inside. And maybe that's the real turn in all of this. You never needed to prove to anyone that your kindness is strength, not weakness. You just needed to stop needing that proof for yourself. From now on, every time someone calls this weakness, you'll know exactly what to say, and you'll probably choose to say nothing. Not because you swallowed it, because there's nothing left to prove. You might reach the end of this video and realize you've lived both versions at different points in your life, and that the line between them was never as fixed as it seemed. That's more common than it looks. Nobody's born knowing how to choose. Most people learn it after years of giving in out of fear, until the day, with no announcement, no speech, no becoming a different person, they start giving in by decision instead. And the strange part is that from the outside, no one notices the shift. The same people keep thinking you're the same as always. The nice one, the easy one, the one who never causes trouble. Only you're not on the inside per used to be. That's the part no camera ever catches, because there's no image for it. There's no visible scene for the moment someone stops disappearing and starts, quietly, choosing. But it happens, and it's the most important moment in this entire story. If any of these scenes has been yours, write one word below, in the comments. Chose. Seneca wrote that a wise person doesn't waste time trying to look strong. She just is.